خالفتم أقوال الشيوخ فأنتم.
Recently, I posted a video proving Islam in 7 minutes. Yes, you heard it. In 7 minutes alone, I was able to produce a prophecy from the Prophet Muhammad, dated back to at least at the end of the 1st century, and establish its fulfillment 500 or 600 years later. Now, I had a Christian buffoon respond to me with a terrible response. I also had a hadith critic, aka hadith projector, respond to me claiming that I stole his diagram and this is a bad prophecy, and it was a very weak attempt at refuting the prophecy. I'm just making this video to show that even with that research, even with that hyper skepticism, they will never be able to refute this prophecy. But I have penned down their objections, so we're gonna go through all of their objections here. So the first objection that this hadith critic had is that apparently the Quran says that the Prophet Muhammad does not have foreknowledge. He doesn't have knowledge of the future. Therefore, he can't possibly predict anything in the future, and anything attributed to him that is prophetic in nature must be a later forgery, because the Quran says that he doesn't have knowledge of the future. The verse that he uses is the following. Chapter 7, verse 188. Say, I have no power to benefit myself or to harm myself. Only what Allah wills happens to me. If I knew the future, I would have increased my wealth and no harm would have afflicted me. I am no more than a warner and a bearer of good news for those who believe. So here, he thinks that, look, the prophet says, I have no knowledge of the future. Therefore, he can't make any prophecies. Now, the buffoon, if he himself read the full verse, it explains to him what it means. He says, if I knew the future, I would have increased my wealth and no harm would have afflicted me. Meaning, if I had general foreknowledge, if I had this general knowledge of the future, of things that would happen to me, I would avoid harm. I would go and I would be wealthy. Everything that is coming in my way to harm me or to afflict me, I would know it beforehand and I would be able to avoid it. But that has nothing to do with the prophet receiving instances of divine foreknowledge. Guess what, my friend? The Quran itself bears witness to this. For example, in Surah Ar-Rum, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals to who? The prophet. And he tells them that the Romans have been defeated, and in 3 to 9 years, they will be again victorious. Now hold on a second. If the prophet received this, then the prophet beforehand had insight into the future. He had specific knowledge that the Romans were just defeated, and in the future, they will be victorious, sir. So did the prophet had foreknowledge or not? According to you, this verse would be a contradiction. According to us, it's not. The prophet had no general foreknowledge. He generally didn't know the future, but God reveals to him certain instances of the future.
You, yes, I'm talking to you. You're an ambassador to Islam everywhere you go. And what better way to be an ambassador to your faith other than rocking a premium Moroccan Gadora or Jalaba as you see me rocking, the Orthodox Muslim. Get yours today on chopanddoodles.com and support the Orthodox Muslim channel.
Another perfect example from the Quran is the following. Check this out with me. In Surah Al-Fath, verse 27, look what it says. لَقَدْ صَدَقَ اللَّهُ رَسُولَهُ الرُّؤْيَا بِالْحَقِّ لَتَدْخُلَنَّ الْمَسْجِدَ الْحَرَامِ إِنْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ آمِنِينَ, which means Allah has indeed fulfilled the true vision He showed to His messenger. You will surely enter Mecca in safety. Well, hold on a second. You're telling me God revealed to the prophet that he will enter Mecca before it happens and he will do it safely? How did that happen? Oh yeah, because God revealed to him that foreknowledge. So that objection goes right into the trash. The next objection that he has, or that both of them have, the Christian buffoon and the hadith rejecting idiot, they claim that, look, this hadith is a fabrication. It goes back to a single common link narrator who likely fabricated it, namely Sa'id ibn Jumhan. This Sa'id ibn Jumhan was active narrating at the end of the 1st century and the start of the early 2nd century, and he dies around, I think, in the year 130 AH. Now, the argument is all the chains that we have start diverging with him. We have about 5 narrations from 3 different collections. We have 2 from Musnad Imam Ahmad, 1 from Abi Dawood, and 1 from Ibn Hibban. All these narrations and asanid go back to who? To Sa'id ibn Jumhan, and I'm going to leave the same diagram I left on the screen. Now, you will see that he is the single common link narrator. Now, by the way, he claims that, oh my God, how could the Orthodox Muslim steal my diagram? Hey, sir, sorry, last time I checked, it's not a crime to take a picture of a diagram on the internet. Now, why did I use the diagram found on the blog? Well, simple. I wanted to research this hadith, bring all the mutun together, and bring all the asanid together and do the ICMA on it, the Isnad Kum Matan analysis, which is a Western academic analysis. It's a methodology to use for hadith to find out how far back they go. People like Motsky and his school use it. Anyway, I see that he already did that for me. He did the work for me. He brought all the asanid together. He brought all the mutun together. He found out the common link narrator. I didn't have to do it. So I used the diagram. And he said, oh, how could you use the diagram on a blog that refutes it? Well, actually, the blog does not refute it. It's actually ironic because the blog that does the ICMA on this hadith, it has no objection to the prophecy itself. And that is why I'm making this video, to respond to all the objections on that blog and to show that this diagram that he made, the narrations that he collected together, the mutun that he collected together, make my case, not his case. So anyway, back to the objection. All the narrations go back to Sa'id ibn Jumhan. This is the single common link narrator. Therefore, he likely fabricated it, he made it up, and others narrated from him, and it ended up in the 3 collections that we have. Now, recall in the first video that I made, I already mentioned this. Why are you bringing this up as an objection against me? I could accept and agree that we cannot go further than Sa'id ibn Jumhan. But that actually has nothing to do with my argument. My argument is the following, and I want you to pay very close attention. This is what they cannot deny, and this is what shoots them in the foot, both of them. We have a 1st century to early 2nd century narrator by the name Sa'id ibn Jumhan. Sa'id ibn Jumhan narrates a prophecy, and we know that it goes back to him, and he claims that he gets it from the Prophet, peace be upon him, through Abdul Rahman ibn Abi Bakr and his brother to Abi Bakr to the Prophet. So he's saying this essentially comes from the Prophet. Now, pay attention. If this prophecy comes to pass, meaning if it finds later fulfillment to the T by the layered detail, then there's 2 options. Either Sa'id ibn Jumhan is a prophet from Allah who had some kind of divine foreknowledge to be able to fabricate such a detailed prophecy, or according to the inference to the best possible explanation, he really got this from somebody who is claiming to be the prophet, who is claiming divine foreknowledge. What is more likely given the historical fulfillment? What is more likely is that this does go back to the prophet, and this is not fabricated by Sa'id ibn Jumhan. Why? Because it comes to pass. Because it is fulfilled to the T. Even if we grant that Sa'id ibn Jumhan fabricated it, now you're going to have to say Sa'id ibn Jumhan sallallahu alayhi wa sallam alayhi salam, the Nabi of Allah. Because according to you now, he's a prophet and he got an accurate prophecy. He predicted something 500 years in advance that finds fulfillment in such a detailed way. Are you going to say that? No. The better explanation is that Sa'id ibn Jumhan, who is himself claiming that it comes from Rasulullah, is not lying. It really comes from Rasulullah, and thus explains the historical fulfillment. That's why in the video I said, you know what? Forget Sa'id ibn Jumhan. Forget the whole chain. Throw away the whole isnad. All the asanid, throw them out. This prophecy is still valid. Why? Because this prophecy still exists in Musnad Imam Ahmad 2 times, in Abi Dawood and Ibn Hibban 1 time. So by the very least, this exists in 3 collections, written and penned down. Forget the chain. Let's put this in a very simple syllogism. Even without chain narration, Sa'id ibn Jumhan, very simple syllogism. Premise 1. There exists a detailed prophecy such that it is recorded by 3 independent sources, namely Musnad Imam Ahmad, Abi Dawood, and Ibn Hibban. Premise 2. The prophecy in its detailed layers comes true a few hundred years later. Premise 3. If the prophecy comes true way after its original time, then it either truly goes back to the prophet who's claiming prophetic foreknowledge, or the compilers came together, fabricated this, and it coincidentally comes to pass. Premise 4. It is very unlikely that they came together and fabricated a prophecy in its very many detailed layers and that it came to pass. Conclusion. The prophecy goes back to the Prophet Muhammad and nobody fabricated it. It is that simple, and no skeptic will be able to deny this. No matter what they bring, no matter what they say, this syllogism cannot be denied as a valid syllogism that follows. The conclusion follows from the premises. Therefore, we could end the video here. The prophecy goes back to the compilers, and we already established that it even goes back to Sa'id ibn Jumhan, who is living in the 1st century. If he fabricated this, then he fabricated something that coincidentally came true. The prophecy came true. It is unlikely that he fabricated it, therefore it is true, and it does go back to the prophet, peace be upon him, and he is a true prophet. So again, this objection is terrible, but I want you to keep what I just said in mind about the fulfillment, proving it goes back to the Prophet Muhammad, as this will help with our later objections. Now, the 3rd objection is that he says there's an earlier version of this prophecy, quote unquote, that goes back to Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. It goes back to him. He says something similar. You find this in Musannaf Abd al-Razzaq, and you find this also in Kitab al-Fitan. Now, the claim is very simple. Because we find earlier versions that go back to the sahabi, therefore, it is not prophetic in its origin. Sa'id ibn Jumhan, he heard this from the sahabi, and he attributed to the prophet, he fabricated other details, but in reality, this doesn't have any prophetic origin. It goes back to the sahabi. Now, I'm going to tell you how that is a flawed, extremely flawed methodology and understanding. This assumes that because we find it earlier from a sahabi without attributing to the prophet, that means it really doesn't go back to the prophet, but it's from the sahabi. This is flawed, and I'll tell you why. It's highly likely that the sahabi heard this from the prophet and reiterated it without attributing it to the prophet. We find many examples of this, where something would be mawquf at a sahabi and it would be marfu' somewhere else with a different sanad. Here is an example on the screen. We have a narration in Musannaf Abd al-Razzaq, narration 147, that reads, Abd al-Razzaq عن الثوري عن الأعمش عن أبي وائل قال عبد الله ibn Mas'ud. So this goes back to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who's a sahabi, and he does not attribute this to the prophet. So Abdullah ibn Mas'ud says, الصلوات كفارات لما بينهن ما اجتنبت الكبائر, which means that the obligatory prayers, they cause that your minor sins be forgiven, as long as you stay away from major sins. You know what the problem is? We find the same exact hadith, the same exact meaning, going back to the prophet in different asanid, and you'll see that on the screen. So can we assume that, oh, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was making this up? No, that is not plausible at all. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud simply heard this from the prophet. He reiterated it to someone else without attributing it to the prophet. Think of this example. Say I hear something from my teacher. My teacher tells me, tomorrow we will have no school. It will be a day off. I go to my friend and I say, Did you know that tomorrow we will have no school and we will have a day off? Notice I did not say I got this from my teacher. Rather, I'm saying this from myself. But that doesn't negate that I really did get it from my teacher, because I went somewhere else and I told another person, did you know that my teacher said that tomorrow we will have no school and we will have a day off? Therefore, just because I told this to someone without attributing it to my teacher, it does not mean that I got it from my teacher. Now, how do we know that this hadith, this prophecy, this narration, even its earlier version that goes back to the sahabi, how do we know that it comes back from the prophet, that it goes back to him? Very simple. I previously established that we know certainly, by certainty, this goes back to the Prophet Muhammad. Why? Because Sa'id ibn Jumhan couldn't have made it up, because it came true. Muslim Imam Ahmad couldn't have made it up, it came true. Ibn Hibban didn't make it up, it came true. And because it came true, then it likely, using the inference to the best possible explanation, goes back to the Prophet. And because it likely goes back to the Prophet, then this historically explains the earlier versions that go back to the Sahabi. The Sahabi heard it from the Prophet and he reiterated it somewhere else. The objection is terrible, it is destroyed, and it's thrown in the bin. Why? All because of naturalistic, pre-assumed methodologies that do not explain the historical fulfillment. Now we can get to the information of the hadith itself. He claimed in his video that I purposely left out the narrations at the bottom of the diagram because I wanted to deceive my followers. You just had the narrations under the diagram, and we didn't need to include the narrations under the diagram. But since you're insisting about the narrations, here you go. I'll put them all on the screen. All 5 narrations will be on the screen now, and everybody can take a look at their translation. He claimed they're not consistent because I had said in the previous video that I made that the mutun are consistent throughout the narrations. He said, no, they're not consistent. Well, come to the whiteboard and let's give you a lesson, my friend. So as you guys can see, I wrote down here the consistent details of the hadith, which show up in multiple narrations. And these are the inconsistent details of the hadith that don't show up consistently in multiple narrations. Let's see what is consistent. There's an area called Al-Basra, consistent. Near a river called the Tigris, consistent. You find this in almost every single narration. There's a numerous population, consistent. Attacked by the children of Keturah, which are the people of the east with broad faces and small eyes, consistent. The 3 groups, consistent. That is all we need to establish a detailed and layered prophetic fulfillment. There was indeed an area called Al-Basra, Bab al-Basra in Baghdad. There was indeed a river called the Tigris River. It was indeed numerous in population. As a matter of fact, Baghdad at that time has the highest population in the world, surpassing over 1 million residents. It was indeed attacked by the children of Keturah, who are identified as the people of the East, Asiatic populations with broad faces and small eyes. And there were indeed 3 groups. So you have a perfect fulfillment. Now let's check the inconsistent details. You have the many date palm trees. That's inconsistent. It barely shows up in any of them. You have the bridge. That's also inconsistent. And you have at the end times. Now, this is important because this is one of the low tier objections. Hey, Orthodox Muslim, look, it says end times, but guess what? This is an inconsistent detail. So it's not included and it's not considered. But even if, let's grant it, even if it says at the end times, let's just correct it here quickly. Even if the hadith does consistently say at the end times, we have no problem with that, as the Prophet and the early community didn't have eminent apocalyptic views, meaning they didn't think that the end times were about to happen right away. As a matter of fact, the death of the Prophet, it comes in narration, is the first sign of the end times. So technically we've been at the end times since the Prophet died. But remember, according to his methodology, this is not consistent, therefore it is not considered. Baked and refuted. The next objection is that the early Muslims understood this to be the Turks, some commented under this narration saying that these people with broad faces and small eyes are the Turks. Therefore, it cannot be the Mongols. Now, you cannot make this up. This has to be the stupidest objection I've ever come across. It is not surprising that when the early Muslims read this narration describing a people with broad faces and small eyes, and they had interacted with an Asiatic people that did have a broad face and small eyes like the Turks, it is not hard to assume that naturally they'd connect the dots together and identify the people from this hadith with the Turks. But that doesn't mean that the Prophet intended the Turks in mind. It just means that Muslims applied this description to something that fit the description in their mind. Also, this is not far-fetched because we have other hadith where the Prophet does give a similar prophecy that the Muslims will fight the Turks who are broad faces and small eyes. So just because they conflated these descriptions with one another and they speculated that this is the Turks, it doesn't mean that it's the Turks. Why? Because we have the perfect later fulfillment with the Mongols who did have broad faces and small eyes. And because there's a perfect fulfillment, therefore it goes back to the Prophet. It's done there. I could just end the video, but we're going to keep responding to all the objections. Just to summarize, the Prophet described a people with broad faces and small eyes. The Muslims interacted with Turks who did have broad faces and small eyes. Therefore, the Muslims mistakenly connected the dots together and identified the people from this hadith with the Turks who have broad faces and small eyes. But they were mistaken because the fulfillment that takes place, that confirms the hadith goes back to the Prophet, had Mongols who also had broad faces and small eyes. The Prophet doesn't specify, rather he gives a general description of an Asiatic population. Therefore, this objection also fails. The next objection is that the hadith says Al-Basra, not Baghdad. Therefore, the Prophet couldn't have been speaking about the sack of Baghdad. This is also wrong, and it's a wrong assumption. Now, I do agree that people who read this hadith, who knew it, where it was circulating, people would naturally assume the Prophet speaking about the city called Al-Basra, and therefore identify Al-Basra in the hadith with the city called Al-Basra. Again, that's not a problem. The point is, there's a perfect fulfillment that finds place in Baghdad. And in Baghdad, there's a huge borough. For instance, take this as an example. Imagine I was a self-proclaimed prophet and I made the following prophecy. In Vancouver, on this day, in this month, on that year, this will take place and this will happen and that will happen. And on that day, in that year, in that month, exactly what I said happened. But it didn't happen in Vancouver, Canada. It happened in Vancouver, Washington, which is a small town. Nobody knows it. When you say Vancouver, usually people would assume you're talking about the big city Vancouver, the Vancouver in Canada. But because this fulfillment does take place in its detail and it's historically fulfilled, we could assume that the intent of the author of the prophecy, of the speaker of the prophecy, was Vancouver, Washington, after all, and not Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. Therefore, because there's a perfect fulfillment in Babul Basra, in Baghdad, we could assume the inference to the best possible explanation that the Prophet had really intended Baghdad, Babul Basra specifically, and not the city Al-Basra. So in conclusion, the prophecy, even if it goes back to Sa'id ibn Jumhan, and he is the single common link, and we cannot trace it beyond him to the Prophet, the mere fact that there is a perfect layered historical fulfillment proves that it goes back to the Prophet. This alone is sufficient. And like I said, even if you remove the chain, the same thing still applies. So you could say that Sa'id ibn Jumhan is da'if and he's weak, and this scholar said he's weak, and that scholar said that he's weak, and this and that. It does not change the fact that there is a beautiful, perfect historical fulfillment, and the inference to the best possible explanation is that Sa'id ibn Jumhan wasn't a prophet, wal'iyadu billah. Rather, he was telling the truth, and he really did receive it from the Prophet after all, because of the fulfillment. Thank you, barakallahu feekum, and I'll see you guys next time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.